Well, welcome to this podcast edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. David, James Madison. It was a listener question that prompted you to say, let's do some programs on Madison. Now we're in it.
It was great fun, too. We both did a lot of reading. I know you came in with a stack of books. The book that I really inspired me was The Three Lives of James Madison.
I've never read it. I'm going to go get it. Feldman.
Noah Feldman. Yeah, it's a massive work.
A massive work. The Three Lives. What are the three lives of Madison?
Genius, partisan, and president.
He was a partisan. Point you made in last week's program that he was like Jefferson's political operator.
He was.
And Jefferson's more like, oh, can't we all get along? Oh, I just like to stay home and grow peaches.
There's one thing I wanted to bring up that was in the show, if I can jump ahead.
Yes, sir.
And that was towards, I think in the third segment, you had a book and you read a quote from Madison about the free press. And I know it's in the show, but I kind of wanted to talk more. Could you read it for people?
And so I want all of our listeners just to think for a moment of what you would expect Jefferson to say about freedom of the press. Some extremely high-minded, noble, poetic thing about given the choice between government without newspapers and newspapers without government. You know how Jefferson talks. Here's Madison. This is about the Sedition Act of 1798. And this, I think, is one of the greatest things ever written in the United States. Madison, some degree of abuse is inseparable from the proper use of everything, and in no instance is this more true than in that of the press. It is better to leave a few of its noxious branches to their luxuriant growth than by pruning them away to injure the vigor of those yielding the proper fruits. To the press alone, checkered as it is with abuses, the world is indebted for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression. I wish that could be posted in the press room at the White House.
It's such a good piece, and that's why I wanted you to read it again, and I'm hoping we can get that quote posted at the jeffersonhour.com site.
Are you listening? To the press alone, checkered as it is with abuses, the world is indebted for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression. Amazing.
I mean, you and I have talked in the past. We get letters from people. One of us will make a comment or a criticism about liberal coverage or conservative coverage, and people write us and take us to task.
They say MSNBC is fine, but Fox is, or Fox is great, but MSNBC is out of control.
Right, and far be it from us to make severe judgments on that. Rather, let's read Madison's quote and think about it.
Well, here's an easy way to look at it. If you want commentary, go to MSNBC or Fox. If you want news, go to NPR, BBC, CBS. Those stations have chosen to follow an ideological approach with partisan commentary on behalf of their tribe.
Right. It's pretty tough for any, CBS.
Dan Rather's
we
CBS.
Have an allegiance for CBS.
I love CBS. We interviewed Mr. Rather for 5 hours.
And a whole bunch of other people, Rita Braver and Charles
had kind of
Osgood.
A thing for her,
I thought she was great.
Yeah, she's great. And Charles Osgood.
He was great, too.
And then we had Bob Schieffer here in Bismarck, North Dakota.
Oh, yeah.
For the big Eric Severide symposium.
I still think,
that I hosted.
you go there and it's not like some fancy impress everybody when you walk in. It's a newsroom, and there's still people in there cranking things out and working hard.
And now I have a friend there named Sasha Reuter, and they're doing a documentary.
Oh, that's right. You were out there, right?
On the Murrow boys.
Go ahead,
Edward R. Murrow, Eric Severide, William L. Shirer, Howard K. Smith, Charles Collingwood, etc. And it's coming. It'll be out in a year or two. I love CBS, and it still has that class. Walter Cronkite, Eric Severide.
Well, you and I started a
Dan
Severide
Rather.
Documentary years ago.
We just need the money. If someone would pony up
we have like a 10-minute trailer. I could
anyone who wants it, we can make available.
Well, we could put that up on the Jefferson Hour page.
Let's do it, and then people maybe want to fund it.
Or whatever.
Or fund us.
It's fun to see it
or
anyway.
Just send gifts of all sorts.
But there are listeners who would like us to say this one's good, this one's bad.
Do you listen to NPR News?
Oh, always.
First rate.
Yeah.
I think it's the best, most balanced, most insightful news we get, and part of it's because it's radio. Mm-hmm. So you're not watching some B-roll of a fire somewhere or a plane. You're listening, and the quality is outstanding.
And a lot of people are hearing us on NPR stations. Not this part of the show, but the regular show itself. Support your local NPR station.
It's listeners like no. So these retreats at Lochsa Lodge, Water in the West, the 13th through the 18th of January, Shakespeare Without Tears, 19 through 23, then Steinbeck's California, the 2nd through the 8th of March, and Jefferson Goes to France in October. So go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. We'll have all sorts of things on there, including this magnificent quotation by Madison.
The last point I wanted to make is, we talked about what Jefferson was, what Madison meant to Jefferson. And you and I, before the show, talked a bit about that. And Jefferson would write a crazy letter, and Madison would go, "Well, I'm not sure.
Sir, let's think about that."
And then he'd have another idea, and Jefferson would respond.
He would always say, Mr. Jefferson, that's such a brilliant idea. Then he'd talk him down off the ledge. And then Jefferson would say, if you're against it, I won't issue it. I won't push send.
Well, so there's so much that we didn't talk about with Madison.
And we're going to do a program on
we
this.
should do it. You were going to maybe...
Like the 4 or 5 moments when clearly Madison was either angry or incredibly frustrated by the Great One.
Well, you said that he'd written... after they finished the convention, there's Madison. He's just like drug out 6, 8 weeks, a hot sun. And he sent a copy to Jefferson, and Jefferson wrote him back and said... Well,
let's have a second convention.
Yeah, it's not quite exactly what
I envisioned. And then Patrick Henry got that letter, and he used it against the ratification in Virginia.
I would like to have...
I'd like to watch Madison's head explode as Jefferson's letter was read out loud.
After we're done here, can we... Well, let's talk about that. Maybe we can do
that. Let's do a show on that. Yeah, I love this. We're on a roll here.
I want to thank everybody for supporting the show. We've gotten some great letters. Who's the fellow the other week ago that sent us about... what was his name? I forgot.
His name is George Bartholomew Jr. of Howard Knob.
Actually, I have the letter right here. It comes from George L. Bartholomew Jr., Howard Knob, Boone, North Carolina. And he was so kind. I won't read it all, but he says, "I'm sure many have singled out your civil discourse, a constant theme of your podcast, as one of the many fine features you embody. I was particularly struck by your conversation with Brad Chrysler in this episode, a fellow you oft mock and chide, but I see you are in reality the best of friends. Thank you for all that you do through this program. I always look forward to the next show, and while we're on that topic," he writes, "I'm asking my wife and 2 children, in lieu of any Christmas gift they might want to purchase for me, to instead donate to your show. I cannot guarantee any large donation, but I am hopeful they will honor my wishes and do so. It is but a small gesture for the pleasure and education you both have given me. Wishing you and your families a very happy holiday season. Sincerely, George L. Bartholomew Jr." And that's about the nicest thing you could. So thanks very much for this. And at this point, I think it's time to go to the show.
Thanks for listening. Tell everyone you know. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson, but seated across from me now is President Thomas Jefferson. And Mr. Jefferson, a delight to see you again, sir.
You too, my dear citizen.
We had a great conversation last week, and I believe it was you that suggested we might rejoin that conversation. We were talking about your good friend, Mr. James Madison, and perhaps for citizens who are not familiar with him, you could give us a brief description of Mr. Madison.
James Madison was the 4th president of the United States. He followed me for 8 years. And when he had completed his 2 terms, James Monroe followed him. This became known as the Virginia dynasty. Mr. Madison was a Virginian. He lived about 35 miles from me at a place called Montpelier. I lived at Monticello. He was a planter and a slaveholder, as was I. We both had an ardent love of religious liberty. In fact, that's what brought us together as friends in 1776. We moved into a deeper friendship and a deeper intimacy and formed a political partnership which lasted for 50 years. In fact, the last letter that I ever wrote to him in February of 1826, just a couple of months before my death, I said, "Take care of me when dead." And I wanted him to make sure that in the remaining years that he had, he protected the thing that he and I had done on behalf of the human aspiration for liberty and minimalist but good government. He's the author of the Bill of Rights, literally, and he's the de facto father of the Constitution of the United States that was written in 1787. He was a great farmer. I said he was the best farmer in the world, actually. And he was a political student, a deep and zealous student of the history of political thought. Had read probably more along these lines than any other person in the New World. And that made him ideal as the author of the Virginia Plan, which set the terms of debate for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. So there's a little introduction to his life.
Well, you lead me to the subject I was hoping we could speak about this week, and that is the Constitutional Convention. Before we get there, though, you were very generous in sharing your library. You wrote to him, quote, "I hope you have found access to my library. I beg you to make free use of it." And Mr. Madison did.
He did. I had a library of about 7,000 volumes. I had 3 libraries, actually, but the main one had about 7,000 volumes. And it was part of my private suite at Monticello, my sanctum sanctorum. And people were not allowed in there. People couldn't just wander in. I extended an invitation for people to use my library on a very select basis. I didn't trust many people in that suite of rooms. I certainly didn't allow people to borrow books after an incident involving the unspeakable Patrick Henry, but that's another story. Mr. Madison had free use of my library. Now, he didn't really need it, sir, because he was one of the best educated Americans. He was not educated in Virginia. I do fault him slightly for that. Instead of going to the good old College of William and Mary, he went up to Princeton.
I believe weather had something to do with his choice, his health.
Yeah, he was of uncertain health and may I say, a bit of a hypochondriac. But he went off to what's now Princeton, then the College of New Jersey, and was fortunate that he became the prize student of James Witherspoon, who was a member of the Scottish Enlightenment and a truly exceptional preceptor. So Madison was arguably better educated than I was, but I had a larger library than he did. He lived within his means in a way that I did not. And so my library was naturally bigger than his. So I offered him free use of that library, and he always read with the deepest concentration and took voluminous notes. That's why he became the best prepared person at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787.
I think it's difficult for Americans during my time, Mr. President, to understand how precarious the situation for this nation was. There was, I don't know what you would call it, perhaps you can help me, but there was a meeting in Annapolis prior to a Constitutional Convention. I think only 7 states attended, which disappointed Mr. Madison, but that was his first attendance at what we might call a constitutional convention. Is that right?
Right. That convention in Annapolis was called to answer some very serious flaws in the first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation.
Well, not only that, the nation was in very bad shape financially.
And that's because the national government under the Articles of Confederation could not tax directly. It could only requisition monies. And so it would say to Virginia, we ask you to provide X percent of the national budget, and the same would go to Maryland or New York. And those states were encouraged to supply funds to the national government, but they weren't required, and they often didn't. And so we had this situation in which there was no real economic authority, and states were engaged in economic rivalries. They had separate foreign policies. They had separate trade relationships with Britain and France and Portugal and so on. There were states that actually got into something like warfare with each other over trade policies. So we had all this chaos, and you couldn't amend the Articles of Confederation except unanimously, and unanimity is almost an impossible test. So we had a kind of semi-paralyzed first Constitution of the United States. It had been made as a matter of expediency during the war. That was also a period where people greatly distrusted centralized authority. And some people believed that we could amend the Articles. I was one of those. A few amendments, I think, would have perfected it. But others, like Hamilton and Madison and eventually George Washington, believed that we had to tear it up and start over to make a blank slate of it. And so they called a modest convention in Annapolis in 1786 to attend to these commercial problems. They had a hard time getting people there, and nothing came of it. It just fell apart. And then rather than despair, Hamilton and Madison said, let's try one more time. This time we'll put it in Philadelphia. We'll make it May of 1787, and we'll circulate private letters and public editorials around the country to make sure everyone understands how grave the crisis is so that people show up. And even then, though, they expected that they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation. It's only when they arrived in Philadelphia in May of 1787 that they decided to tear it up and start over. The plan was amendments. They did not do that. They began from nothing and then crafted the Constitution, which the people of the United States still use in your own time.
And Madison had sort of a grand theory in mind, fair to say. When they met, he already had a plan in mind.
He did. He had written to me. I was not there. I was in France serving as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI. I was there at that critical moment when the French Revolution began. I was the most fortunate of men to see two revolutions in one lifetime. And so I did not participate in the Constitutional Convention. I'm not one of the authors of the Constitution of the United States, although I could maybe say that I was the bibliographer, because Madison wrote to me. We by now were deep friends and political partners. And he said, we don't know what we're doing here. I mean, this is unprecedented. We're a body of men that are going to meet to craft a new Constitution. How do we do this? How can I prepare? And so I went around to all the bookshops in Paris, and I bought scores of books, 80-some books for Mr. Madison, and sent them to him. No easy thing. And said, if you read this body of literature about the history of constitutions and the history of politics and political theory, you'll be ready. And, one does this. I was always being asked to supply lists of books and recommend courses of reading and what a modest library would look like, what a law library would look like, and so on. I enjoyed this very much. And in most cases, people would take my advice and buy the books, but not necessarily read them. Madison took the books that I sent him and read them, and he read them with his usual precision and focus and note-taking style. And on the basis of all of that, he developed an alternative approach to constitutions, and this became known as the Virginia Plan. He wanted a centralized government that was strong enough to tax the people of the United States, not requisition their monies. He wanted a central government that could prevent states from squabbling over tariffs and trade politics. And he wanted a central government that would create a sufficient national authority that the states would have a final arbiter in case they fell into disputes. And so that Virginia Plan became the basis for all subsequent conversation in Philadelphia. It didn't finally prevail. The Constitution that you have has an important alteration of Madison's plan. Madison wanted proportional representation. That is, the larger and more populous the state, the more power it would have in the Union. But the small states, Delaware and Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New Jersey, objected to this notion because they felt that they would be swallowed up by the giants, New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia. And so the small states said, we will not put our names to any constitutional document that is merely proportional in its representation. The states have to be units, as they had been, by the way, under the Articles of Confederation. Each state had one vote. If that's not the case, we will not agree to ratify or even participate in this process. And the Constitutional Convention nearly fell apart on the basis of that impasse. And finally, something called the New Jersey Plan, which was of states' rights, a state-based system, was put in the same basket with the Virginia Plan, and a compromise was worked out, and you know what that produced. Each state gets an identical number of senators, but each state gets a proportional number of congressmen, and that's called the Great Compromise. It did violate Madison's Virginia plan, but he got more than he would have gotten had he not done that prep.
Well, my understanding is that he wanted to give the legislature a negative over state laws. In other words, they could use force to make states comply. And we need to take just a short break, Mr. Jefferson. Perhaps we can discuss that and some of the other points of this constitutional convention when we return.
Of course. He was wrong about that, by the way.
You're certain?
Yes.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. And this week, Mr. Jefferson has been good enough to talk to us about his friend James Madison. Now, when we took our break, Mr. Jefferson, we were talking about the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and you pointed out that you were not there, but you must have kept in touch with Mr. Madison as to what was going on.
Well, I tried, but they formed a secrecy pact. They decided early on that they would not speak or write about the deliberations within Independence Hall outside of it. So they would not carry any of these conversations into taverns or the boarding houses or into their correspondence with constituents, because it was felt that that would put too much pressure on them, that they needed the sort of exclusivity of not having external pressures in order to be able to make these very difficult choices for the future of the country. So Mr. Madison could easily have written me quietly about what was going on. He did not. He honored the commitment that they had all made, and so we corresponded during this period, not much because he was extraordinarily busy in Philadelphia, but he did not divulge much. Only after they finished did he write me a 17-page letter enclosing a handwritten copy of the Constitution and explaining it clause by clause and article by article. But up till that time, I didn't know what they had produced. I was, I have to say, a bit staggered by it, but that's perhaps another conversation. So Madison was the de facto father of the United States Constitution because he had done all that hard reading and digested his reading and had come forth early on in the process with what was known as the Virginia Plan. And as you say, part of his idea was that the national government would have veto power over acts of state legislature.
You disagreed with that?
Yes. So this really gets to be a kind of a fundamental philosophical debate. What is America? What is the United States? The name would seem to me to be the answer. It is the United States, and those states are Virginia and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Georgia and so on.
But he believed that the large states would overrule the small states and that they would have no choice but to go along with it.
But he wasn't really in favor of the states at all. I mean, he believed there would be states, but the national government begins with the phrase, "we the people." And so the sense was that the government emanated from the population at large, some of whom lived in New Jersey and some of whom lived in South Carolina. I disagree so strongly with that. I don't think that the United States is a nation which happens to have some political boundaries or some geographic boundaries known as the states of Virginia and New Jersey. I believe that the Articles of Confederation had it right, that the United States is a collection of sovereign states named South Carolina and Vermont and New Hampshire. And those sovereign states had formed a compact to do certain national and international things, but that in all domestic affairs, the sovereignty lay in New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Delaware, Massachusetts, Connecticut, etc. So I have a state-based compact idea of the Constitution, which I happen to believe is the right one. Madison believed in a nation in which there were still states, but they were decidedly subordinate to the national authority. I saw mischief there. So we disagreed on this subject.
I've read that Mr. Hamilton wanted to do away with state governments. Did Madison go that far?
No, Madison did not. But he had seen how difficult it was to prosecute the war with such a loose authority, a compact theory of states, and the states were often recalcitrant and refused to provide the monies that they should, refused to supply troops, horses, hay, blankets, muskets, gunpowder, lead, you name it. And so Madison's view was you can't be a nation unless the national government has sovereign authority. It doesn't have to be a 100%, but the states have to be, in many respects, subordinate to that national sovereign authority.
And how did you react to that, Mr. Jefferson?
I'm a Virginian. I believe that I am a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia first. I called it my country. And that I am an American citizen second. And that Virginia should exist as a separate sovereign entity, except in such limited powers as it has freely granted to the national government. In other words, Virginia is like France or Portugal or Spain or Ireland or Great Britain or Denmark or Norway. It's a nation. It may choose to allow certain functions to be handled by a national authority called the United States of America. But essentially, Virginia remains a nation state like Portugal. That's my theory of the thing. Mr. Madison felt, no, we've seen that doesn't work. It's too loose a confederacy. It led to all sorts of difficulties. We're going to need more national authority than that. But Hamilton went even much farther, and he would have reduced the states to mere administrative units and would have effectively abolished them altogether.
Well, when the vote came on that, I believe only 3 states upheld Mr. Madison's idea, and they were the larger states, your Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. His idea on that went down to defeat.
And thank goodness that it did. This eventually, I won't say resolved itself, but it found expression in the 10th Amendment, which, by the way, was authored by none other than James Madison. Once the Constitution was completed, there was widespread disenchantment with it, particularly because it did not contain a Bill of Rights. Madison was not convinced that a Bill of Rights was necessary. He at one point called it a mere parchment guarantee.
For listeners who don't know, could you explain briefly what the 10th Amendment said?
Yes, the 10th Amendment, the last of the series, so 10 were ratified on December 15th, 1791, and the 10th says those powers not delegated to the national authority belong instead to the states and to the people. I repeat, that meant that the Constitution, once ratified, placed certain authority in the national government. But those powers not delegated to the national government belong still and permanently to the states and to the people.
Well, it's very clear. The wording makes one understand. It's got a vagueness about it that I think haunts us to this day, Mr. President.
We are best as a nation when there is a careful balance between state sovereignty and federal authority. When either one gets out of control, out of balance, if there's too much state authority or too much national authority, the system begins to break down. It's when they are in a lively and mutually respectful balance that things go well. Take, for example, the Alien and Sedition laws that were passed during the Adams administration in 1798. They were passed by a Federalist Congress. They were signed into law by a Federalist president. The court system did not even attend to them. So there was no remedy. These were clearly unconstitutional laws. They were worthy of the 9th or 10th century. Nothing checked them in the national government. So the answer was to invoke the 10th Amendment and to say, if the national government won't self-police when it gets out of hand, then the states are the next bulwark of human liberty. And I wrote secretly the Kentucky resolutions. Madison wrote secretly the Virginia resolutions. And they basically said when the national government breaks the compact and it intrudes itself into areas that were not granted to it, and if the national government won't self-police, then the answer is the states. And we, the people in this case, I wrote Kentucky, he wrote Virginia, we, the people of Virginia, are remonstrating and saying that the national government has broken the compact and it exceeded its constitutional authority. You're right, it's a bit messy, but I'd prefer that to a very efficient, hyper-strong, centralized government of the sort that Mr. Hamilton wanted.
It was Mr. Madison that initially introduced the concept of 3 separate branches of government, correct?
Yes, in the Virginia Plan, but keep in mind that this goes back to the ancient world, to Polybius, to the Roman Republic. These are ancient concepts, but they had been applied in the modern world by Montesquieu in his extraordinarily important treatise, The Spirit of the Laws. He was French, and everyone was working from their Montesquieu at this point. And so the idea was that there would be a kind of monarchical branch of government, the executive, a kind of democratic branch of government, the Congress, and then there would be the judicial branch of government, that these 3 branches would represent different ways of canvassing the will of the people, and they would then check and balance each other so that no one entity had too much authority in too centralized a way. So this is one of the parts of the Virginia Plan, but it was not at all created or invented by Mr. Madison.
But that was important, that the 3 branches of government would have the opportunity to, as you put it, check and balance each other. That was a critical part of the plan, was it not?
This squares with my own belief that if you put unlimited power in one person, he will become corrupt. He will become despotic. But if you diffuse that power, for example, in the Roman Republic, there were 2 consuls, so 2 kings, 2 presidents. So if one was corrupting Rome, the other one could check him. The more you diffuse power, the safer you are. That's why if you diffuse power widely through the whole geography of America, then nobody has much power and nobody can lord it over everybody else. There has to be consensus. There has to be persuasion by way of majority rule. The more you diffuse these things, the better off you are. And so the idea was, instead of having a single king like Great Britain, or a king who's in some ways in control of Parliament, as Britain was, let's have a more diffuse system of putting some authority in the judiciary, some in the Senate, some in the House, some in the executive, and some in the governor's mansions.
The disagreements among the attendees at the Constitutional Convention were pretty deep.
I wasn't there, of course, but Mr. Madison took essentially verbatim notes.
Do you regret that? Do you wish you could have been part of that convention?
No. If I had been in this country, I doubt that I would have attended. Now, this will sound perhaps aloof, but I might have sent in a draft from Monticello, sent it down with Mr. Madison saying, take a look at it. If you like it, you may have it. But I don't like gatherings of ambitious men. It makes me nervous. It makes me want to escape. I see myself as a gardener, a farmer, an amateur scientist, a man of letters. I have no political ambitions.
That's another interesting point to go to, because as we leave the convention, I'd like to talk to you a bit about Mr. Madison's influence on you, sir.
My point is, I don't think I would have attended. Had I been drafted, I might have gone, but it's not my sort of thing. I would have been happier to be called upon to do research or to write a draft, but to go and debate, I'm not cut out for that sort of thing.
The discussions went on at the Constitution, and as you say, there was a New Jersey plan and a Virginia plan. And
you asked about disputes.
Right.
2 of them. Many little ones, but 2 fundamental disputes. Big states versus little states. Mm-hmm. That nearly cost us a constitution. Mm-hmm. There were 2 points during the course of the summer when the thing just about fell apart. Only taking some time to get away from each other and some really good leadership on compromise. So that was one dispute, big states versus little states. The other issue was slavery. And slavery, is the issue of American life. And the southern states wanted to protect slavery. The northern states wanted to get rid of slavery, essentially. And the convention nearly broke down several times over that issue.
Well, Madison argued about, the large states, and they all had different interests. And, Pennsylvania was produced flour, Virginia tobacco, Massachusetts fish.
New England was shipping.
How could they combine all this and not sort of devour the smaller states? The smaller states would get lost in all of this.
Rhode Island was the last to ratify. I mean, they waited beyond all other states in ratifying the Constitution. The little states like Delaware and Rhode Island felt, we'll be swallowed up. There will be nothing left of us.
Was that a fair assessment, a fair fear?
If the Madison Plan had been adopted as it was first presented, it might have been very difficult for those little states.
Well, Madison was a Virginian. I think he expected Virginia to be a bigger part in the end.
It should be, because Virginia was the largest and most populous state. It was the nursery of Patrick Henry and George Washington.
Spoken like a true Virginian, sir.
We Virginians believe that we have the ideal climate. We have enough space to move west for generations, perhaps forever. We have the Chesapeake, which is great river systems, the James and the Potomac and so on. Our only problem in Virginia is slavery.
At the end of the convention, near the end of the convention, something happened with Benjamin Franklin. I suspect you know what I'm talking about. Could you share that
when
with
he was
us?
leaving the...
He asked for something to change in how the meetings were opened.
So a couple of things about Franklin. First of all, he was elderly, universally loved, but there were people that sort of rolled their eyes too, because he was a bit of a raconteur. And he had special privileges. He was carried around Philadelphia in a sedan chair by inmates from the prisons, and he could hardly walk at this point. But I revered him. I will not allow him to be ridiculed or criticized in any undue way. But Franklin saw the disputatiousness. I mean, I think it's hard for people in your time to realize how lucky you are that you got a Constitution. This thing could have fallen apart in any number of ways, and nearly did.
And it was Benjamin Franklin that really broke this deadlock. He said, quote, "We have viewed modern states all round Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstances." And then he went on and said that the delegates were, quote, "groping as if it were in the dark, and perhaps they should turn to the Father of Lights to illuminate our understandings."
He finally said, I think we better institute prayer. He actually suggested that they have a daily prayer to maybe calm them down and remind them that the whole world was watching and that this is a providential moment. And when he said that, Hamilton said, "Why bring in foreign authorities?"
I looked at that as a brilliant move. Now, knowing, as I do from you, that in his adult life, Franklin never set foot in a church. He was a deist.
A free thinker.
But what he did was to sort of rein in the committees and the attendees and say, we can do something bigger and better, make them look at it differently.
You could say that it was a form of political theater, but what he was really doing was saying, remember, there's something larger at stake here. Try to put down your petty state local interests, the shipping industry or the cod industry or the slave industry or the tobacco industry, your regionalism, your religious affiliations. Try to tamp them down and realize there's something much, much, much more important at stake here. And so he invoked Providence, God, as a way of getting people out from under their selfish interests. A brilliant moment of political theater.
There is so much more we could talk about with Mr. Madison, his time as your Secretary of State, his time as President. But sadly, sir, we are out of time for this part of our conversation this week. Any last thoughts?
Well, I should say this, that Madison is the most underrated, in my view, of the Founding Fathers. I could not have achieved a fraction of what I did if it hadn't been for our partnership and friendship. And at some point, I hope we will return to Mr. Madison to talk about his prosecution of the War of 1812, but also the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 and his leadership in bringing the country back to good sense.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson, just sneaking in a little announcement between segments of the Jefferson Hour. I want you to join me this winter at Locksaw Lodge, west of Missoula, for 2 humanities cultural retreats. The first one, Water in the West, January 13th through 18th, and the second, Shakespeare Without Tears, January 19th through 24th. For more information, go to our website, jeffersonhour.com/tours. We'll see you in the mountains. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, now out of costume and character, sitting across from my good friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson.
Hello, sir.
I've sort of fallen in love with Madison in the last couple of weeks researching
Quirky
this.
fellow.
He is a little odd. He told risque jokes at dinner parties. There was a little, ribald, maybe not so PC.
Well, it's
Madison.
said that he told jokes that would make Jefferson laugh so hard he would cry.
And to think that Jefferson ever even laughed is because you don't think of Jefferson as a laugher. You think of him smiling.
Yeah.
But imagine Jefferson laughing out loud. How great. How great if it actually happened.
That'd be interesting to know.
Let me read you something that Madison wrote in 1832. So in his last letter to Madison, Jefferson said, "Take care of me when dead," meaning protect me against my enemies. And in 1832, Jefferson was being misquoted by Southern nullificationists and people who were kind of holding up the federal government. Madison tried to protect Jefferson. He said this, David. This is almost the key to understanding Jefferson. Madison said, "Allowances ought to be made for a habit in Mr. Jefferson, as in others of great genius, of expressing in strong and round terms impressions of the moment." Isn't that great?
Read that once more.
Allowances ought to be made for a habit in Mr. Jefferson, as in others of great genius, of expressing in strong and round terms impressions of the moment.
Boy, you could really get some argument from both sides on that if you wanted to be a lawyer.
But if you want to translate this into slang, it's like,
It's okay, the guy's crazy.
the guy has some whoppers. There are whoppers in
it's
Jefferson.
worth it in the end,
but
right?
If you just tone it down a little, stay with him. Don't take the bait on all the wild stuff that came out of his mouth. I think that's right.
Well, I look at it like Jefferson was a creative genius. He had the ability, because he was such a polymath,
Yes.
he had the ability to take something he had learned from gardening and something he had learned from architecture and all his many sciences and somehow take all of these odd facts, and his creative mind would allow him to bring them together and apply it to who knows what, government, what's for dinner. And Madison knew he didn't have that creative ability.
And he knew that he had to make Jefferson focus.
And I don't know how, I get that, and I'm pretty sure that that's accurate.
I do too.
I'm not sure where Jefferson was in all of this. If he actually went, yeah, I'm kind of a crazy guy, and I want to do these things.
No, but I'll tell you what he did.
And I need a guy like Madison to help me make it happen.
Jefferson would sit down in his study and write this crazy letter to Madison about tearing up the Constitution every 19 years or whatever it was. One time he was promoting secession of Virginia if it didn't get its way. Madison would receive these letters. I'm sure he thought, oh my, here we go. But then he would sit down and he would write Jefferson a response that said, great idea, probably not going to work in the real world, but great idea, but here's some issues. And Jefferson invariably would say, fair enough, I withdraw it. If you say it's not a good idea, I won't do it. So he always listened to Madison. When Madison said, I wouldn't push send on that.
So there was sort of
Jefferson
a freedom
pulled it back.
for Jefferson, because he could go to Madison and be as crazy as he wanted, knowing that Madison would save him. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but just going back, when you say crazy,
okay, maybe that's a bad word.
no, it's right. But remember, Jefferson might have been the most brilliant man who ever lived. In other words, maybe he's right that we should tear up the Constitution every 19. Maybe there's a point to all of this that Jefferson has. He's not just some kind of Mr. Magoo figure or some guy who just is some eccentric. Jefferson has thought through the problems of culture. He has a set of solutions. Admittedly, they are radical. That doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but a person who loves tradition and is a realist like Madison looks on this and says, careful here. I wouldn't send that one out. That's dangerous.
It would be great to do another show on Madison where you could direct us to a couple of letters where we could sort of see how that worked.
Let's do that, because I was thinking about this over the weekend in preparing for this program, David, and I thought we should do a program on the 3 or 4 or 5 times where Madison was actually upset with Jefferson, like now he's really gone too far. For example, Jefferson writes these letters blithely from France talking about the problems of the new Constitution draft. And Madison has just given year and his best energies of his life to
easy for you to walk in.
And Jefferson's like, oh, what if let's have a second constitutional convention.
Are you nuts?
And Madison's like, how dare you, knowing nothing about what the process was, with your usual, we'll just regather and it'll be better this time, and man's up to it. He must have been either hurt or angry or both,
probably
or
both.
Miffed.
Yeah.
But he certainly was frustrated. And then, guess what? Their mutual enemy, Patrick Henry, at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, quoted Jefferson's letters against ratification. So here's Madison. His best friend is in France. Here's Patrick Henry, someone they both distrust and even hate. And Henry stands up and says, I have a letter here from our current ambassador to France saying that the Constitution is a bad idea. Imagine Madison sitting there thinking, this is my best friend? My best friend.
Well, that would be a fun show.
So we should do like the moments when Madison was just like, oh my.
Before you leave today, let's talk about that.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
I made a list of them.
We have a couple of shows coming up that we need to do, and that would be noting the new year.
Christmas and the new year.
Not that far away, but I'm pretty fascinated by Madison right now, too. So.
Me too, and there's more to it. So I'm reading this book. I know you read a book called The 3 Lives of James Madison.
3 Lives of James Madison by Noah Feldman was one I read.
I'm reading David O. Stewart's Madison's Gift. There's a Lynn Cheney slender volume about Madison that was published a couple of years ago, and plenty more.
The Andrew Burstein and Nancy Eisenberg, Madison and Jefferson is pretty good.
We'll post those titles, and we'll post other things on the Jefferson Hour related to this.
The Lynn Cheney book is James Madison: A Life Reconsidered. It's a short read, but it's good.
Do I have time to just to quote one passage from Madison?
Please do, and then it will be time for this week's essay, which is pretty special.
So this is something I just came across. It was underlined, so I must have read it before, but it's about freedom of the press. I think this is really why we need Madison more than almost anybody. Jefferson would say something like, given the choice between government without news, but one of those things. Here's Madison. Some degree of abuse is inseparable from the proper use of everything, and in no instance is this more true than that of the press. It is better to leave a few of its noxious branches to the luxuriant growth than by pruning them away to injure the vigor of those yielding the proper fruits. To the press alone, checkered as it is with abuses, the world is indebted for all the triumphs which have been gained by reason and humanity over error and oppression. That's about as strong a defense of freedom of the press as I've ever seen.
I hope we can get that posted on the Jefferson Hour site.
And I don't even have to say this. It's a living rebuke to the current antagonism towards a free press emanating from some quarters.
And with that, sir, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Sometimes I wonder what it must have been like to be James Madison. He was a diminutive genius who did not call attention to himself. He was a balding hypochondriac who was always sure he did not have enough vitality for the hurly-burly of our early national politics. He was a profound reader, a digester of the history of republics and constitutions going all the way back to Aristotle and Polybius. After some romantic stumbling, Madison married the widowed Dolly Todd on September 15, 1794, a woman almost infinitely more charismatic than the man she called the Great Little Madison. There was nothing flashy about him. He lived in the shadow of a generation of giants: George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall, and, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who somehow was his best friend. And yet, in some respects, James Madison was the greatest of all of them. He is certainly the most underrated of the Founding Fathers. It's fair to say that Madison would never have been the 4th president of the United States had it not been for the 3rd president, the Sage of Monticello. I like to say that James Madison was a great man who gave the best energies of his life to a greater man who lived about 35 miles away. Jefferson was always trying to get his closest friends to relocate near his fortress of solitude at Monticello. He had in mind a kind of Enlightenment agrarian colony, an actual, not virtual, republic of letters. Jefferson and his circle of like-minded friends would make wine, hold salon dinners, exchange garden seeds, experiment in science and agriculture, perfect the art of Republican conversation, pool their libraries, nurture young future leaders of the American Republic, and hold themselves aloof from Mr. Hamilton's money-grubbing, industrial, stock-exchanging America. Jefferson's mini-utopia never quite gelled, though his protege, James Monroe, set up his own headquarters within sight of Monticello, and the Italian horticulturalist and Republican Philip Mazzei took up residence nearby for a few years before returning to Europe as a kind of publicity agent for the American experiment. Madison seems to have regarded the 35 miles that separated him from Jefferson as about the right distance, close enough to get there in a long day, far enough away to avoid being entirely absorbed by the whimsical force of Jefferson's mighty personality and his impractical vision of America. Jefferson was a utopian visionary who had a magnificent dream of a highly educated, lightly governed agrarian paradise of self-actualized farmer citizens living in actual democracy at the local level and a tightly representative democracy in the larger geography of Virginia and the United States. Madison did not entirely disagree with this, but he reckoned that if you removed the soaring Jeffersonian rhetoric, toned the thing down, and replaced the poetry with a pragmatic program that took into account that most people were never going to be exemplars of the Enlightenment, now you would have something better than all of the other nations in the world. He was a chastened Jeffersonian, a realistic, pragmatic, at times reluctant Jeffersonian, but he could never break with Jefferson in the way that he did first with Hamilton and later even with George Washington. Jefferson was a genuine political radical who was not afraid to praise upheaval and invite revolutionary adjustments to corrupt or stagnant governments. It was Jefferson who said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Madison could never have written that sentence. He believed that the tree of liberty, if you insist on such organic metaphors, Mr. Jefferson, must occasionally be carefully pruned by a cautious and well-read gardener. Madison did not like the idea of upheaval, yet his famous friend was always soaring off with plans to tear up the Constitution every 19 years, or declare the national debt void after each statistical generation, or threaten nullification or secession if the government of the United States overstepped its constitutional bounds. They exchanged 1,250 letters in the course of their 50-year friendship. I like to imagine Madison seeing a letter from Jefferson in the pile of mail. Jefferson's exquisite penmanship was unmistakable, and turning to Dolly with a wry smile and saying, "Well, here we go." Jefferson would be about to envision some brilliant and fundamentally impracticable future, all dream and no infrastructure, all principle and no logical path to success. And it would be James Madison's challenge to determine if any part of Jefferson's vision could be sobered up, disciplined down, and distilled into something that had a chance of working in the real world. Then he would have to write an extremely carefully crafted response to Jefferson, twice as long as the original, to talk Jefferson down off the ledge without hurting the great man's feelings or causing Jefferson to try out his utopian projects on other correspondents more susceptible to what I like to call the Jefferson music. If you know Raphael's famous Vatican painting, The School of Athens, you get the picture of the nature of what many historians have called the most successful and productive political friendship in American history. Jefferson was Plato in his red tunic, looking a good deal like the disheveled Leonardo da Vinci, with a finger pointed up to the sky, to the world of pure idea, the empyrean, the other world, to the cosmos where there was no human imperfection and no human nature. Madison was Aristotle, Plato's grounded pupil, dressed in blue with a carefully trimmed beard, clutching a big folio in one hand, the other hand well below his shoulder, stretched out in a calming, let's bring it down to the real world gesture. Plato is looking off into the distance with a countenance of deep certainty. Aristotle is looking directly at Plato, and he is wearing a look of concern, as if to say, "Oh my, here we go again with the world of pure forms." Nothing could be more emblematic of the relationship between Jefferson and Madison than Raphael's great painting. And yet, Madison never spoke harshly to Jefferson, even when his mentor, who was in France through the whole birthing ordeal of the U.S. Constitutional Convention, wrote letters that were used by anti-federalists to oppose ratification of Madison's greatest achievement. Madison must have loved Jefferson deeply. He admired the genius of the great man, and he realized that without the Jefferson music, America could not achieve its potential. That Hamilton's world was prosperous and powerful without being poetic. That John Adams' world was so fastened with restraining mechanisms and checks and balances that it could never soar. That Washington's world was too sober to lift humanity to the next level of its evolution. Madison realized that we needed Jefferson perhaps more than any other of the founders, but that Jefferson could not be entirely trusted to envision a realizable republic. It was Madison's job to talk Jefferson out of his wilder ideas, his radical states' rights doctrine in 1798, his occasional secessionist impulses, his apparent attraction to political violence, his indifference to political stability and tradition, his willingness in 1803 to turn down the Louisiana Purchase because it seemed unconstitutional. Not only did Madison perform his Aristotelian role with magnificent patience and prudence, there must have been times when he was a little fed up with Jefferson's habits of mind, but he periodically suited up and entered the gladiatorial arena on behalf of Jefferson and Jeffersonianism, in spite of his preference for the safe world of the study and the dining room. When Jefferson knew he was dying, he wrote one of his greatest letters to James Madison. It was dated February 17, 1826. Jefferson was 83, Madison was 74. Jefferson had just 137 days left to live. The beloved disciple would live another 10 years. In that last letter, Jefferson wrote, "The friendship which has subsisted between us now half a century, and the harmony of our political principles and pursuits have been sources of constant happiness to me through that long period. If ever the earth has beheld a system of administration conducted with a single and steadfast eye to the general interest and happiness of those committed to it, it is that to which our lives have been devoted. To myself, you have been a pillar of support through life. Take care of me when dead, and be assured that I shall leave with you my last affections." Take care of me when dead. Think about that. On the brink of death, Jefferson asked Madison for one more gift of friendship, to protect Jefferson's reputation against those who would seek to deny or delimit or degrade his unbelievably important contributions to the founding of the United States, what, in his first inaugural address, Jefferson called the world's best hope. And I need hardly say, Madison performed that last task impeccably, though he probably spent a fair amount of time shaking his head. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.